Yevhen Hlibovytsky is a director of the Frontier Institute, a cross-sectoral think tank researching social transformation trajectories and strategic challenges in and around Ukraine. Yevhen has extensive experience in Ukraine's reform sector. In the last 20 years, he's worked for the OSCE and other international organizations in countries of Central Asia, Caucasus, and Central and Eastern Europe, building a comparative understanding of transformation in post-communist countries. He's frequently engaged by the Atlantic Council, Chatham House, and other think tanks for discussions on Ukraine and the transformation of post-Soviet countries and economies. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, if you like the materials after you've seen the video, subscribe and share around to help new people find our incredible guests. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description. It is incredibly important to help Ukraine remain resilient at this time. Yevhen, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's turn all the way back, because of course we're going to discuss the war, we're going to discuss Russian aggression, but it didn't start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014. One could argue it didn't start in 1991 when Ukraine almost accidentally received its independence, but it goes back through a long history of Russian imperialism. But let's start with 1991 in this case, because you must have some memories of that period. Obviously, you're considerably younger at that point, as was I. In 1992, I was in Moscow and I met what I thought was my first Russian, who was the sort of flatmate or student in the other sort of cubicle in Moscow State University. He turned out to be Ukrainian. And back then in 1992, very patiently tried to explain to me why Ukraine and Russia were different. I think my brain struggled against that because Ukraine was not really an entity that was known in the West. Maybe you could explain better what was going on there and how Ukraine achieved its independence.
Well, actually, when we are looking at Ukraine's independence, we are looking at a phenomena that is basically invisible for the outsider. The existence of Ukrainian society was not understood as existence of a separate nation, like the case with the Baltic occupied countries by the Soviet, or I don't know, Central Asian republics. The reason is that Ukraine was actually part of the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union was created, and Ukraine had a short-lived independence in the beginning of the 20th century as the aftermath of the First World War. And because Ukraine has become independent and has claimed its statehood, even though that statehood had suffered a defeat to the Bolsheviks, the communists were basically forced to form a Soviet Union not as a single unitarian state, but as a federation, or so-called federation, because it wasn't in fact a federation, of national republics. So in a sense, Soviet Union early on recognized the existence of other identities. And Ukraine was one of those republics that technically formed Soviet Union. This is where Putin's claim that Lenin has came up with the idea of Ukraine, that's where it comes from. In fact, it wasn't from Lenin. Lenin was actually opposing the Ukrainian statehood, but you just couldn't ignore it. In the 1920s, there were thousands of revolts against the Soviet rule in Ukraine. And this forced the Soviet authorities to come up with the policy that they called the routing. That basically meant that the Soviet Union in Ukraine had to create a very pro-Ukrainian interface to interact with the Ukrainian society in Ukrainian language with pro-Ukrainian ideas. And that was basically the late 20s and early 30s were the revival of the Ukrainian national scene. All of that was completely destroyed during the famine and during the Stalinist repressions in 1930s. So Ukraine had to be subjugated. And then 100% of Ukraine's territory was occupied by the Nazi Germany. Only 3% of the Russian territory were occupied by the Nazi Germany. But somehow in the Western perspective, it was Russia that was occupied by the Nazis, not Ukraine. And it was important to understand that for Ukraine, from Ukrainian perspective, that was one catastrophe after the other. There was the loss of independence, then this famine that took away, man-made famine, Stalin-made famine, that took away millions of lives, the Stalinist repressions that took away the cultural elites. Actually, Stalin was after any agency. He was after anyone, even if those people were Stalinists themselves, but they had their own agency, they were a threat. And the Germans actually applied a very similar policy. They were against any Ukrainian agency. There was an attempt to proclaim independence in 1941 when the Germans entered Lviv. And everyone involved spent the rest of the Second World War in the concentration camp. Then it looked like Ukraine was actually completely powerless and completely occupied, but it was big. The size of Ukraine was actually important. So Stalin could not resettle Ukrainians. That was one of the ideas that he had. He wanted to resettle Ukrainians elsewhere in Soviet Union and settle that territory with the Russians. He tried to do something like this with the Crimean Tatars, with the Chechens, but Ukrainians were simply too big in quantity and too large of a nation to do that. And this is one of the reasons why Ukrainians hold on to the territory the way they do right now. And this is the reason why Ukrainians are so keen about preserving the Ukrainian lives, because historically that was the case, that the sheer number mattered. And then when the Soviet Union was ending its collapse, and catastrophes in Ukraine kept happening, like Chernobyl, for instance, in 1986. So I would put it this way: Ukrainians were at that time very transformed by the Soviet Union. The independently minded elites were mostly destroyed. Ukraine had a very prominent dissident movement, but that dissident movement was, I would say it was qualitative, not quantitative, and could not reach the mainstream. So Ukraine had its own national liberation movement at the moment of collapse of the Soviet Union, but that national liberation movement never reached its critical mass. So we had two referendums in 1991. The first one is almost forgotten by everyone but historians, and that was in March of 1991, when Gorbachev was trying to redo the Soviet Union. Basically, Yeltsin destroyed the Soviet Union in 1990 by the concept of state sovereignty. This is a very oxymoronic concept of judicial concept, that the legal norms of the lower level have higher authority than the legal norms of the higher level. So basically what he did, he proclaimed that the Russian laws in the Soviet Russia had higher authority than the Soviet norms. This way, basically, Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. And when Yeltsin did it in his bid to fight Gorbachev, all the other republics were basically caught in a wake, and they couldn't. The communist leaders in these republics couldn't believe their luck. They just got the concept that meant that they are running the place now. So they did that, and Gorbachev was trying to redo the Soviet Union, to reignite the Soviet Union, and what he came up with was signing the new Soviet treaty. There was a referendum about that, and 70% of Ukrainians, with very high turnout rate, I think we had 84% or something like that, 70% of Ukrainians said, yes, we want to live in the Soviet Union. And the reason for that was that the Soviet Union has become quite weak and quite soft. And it offered a much better social contract than anything that Ukrainians lived through before. And that social contract was basically that the state gives Ukrainians the welfare in exchange for Ukrainians giving up their most of their political rights. And that seemed like a fair deal to many Ukrainians at that point. Then when the coup in Moscow happened in 1991, and when the hardliners tried to take over, and what we often don't remember is that Gorbachev was actually coming from the camp of hardliners. One of the reasons he was entrusted the reforms was because he was part of the probably most reactionary group in the communist system, and his group basically took over in a coup, and they threatened that they would go back to Stalinism, and that was not in the social contract. So the quest from the point of view of the Ukrainian society back then in 1991 was not whether the citizens can accept greater responsibility for their lives and implement, realize their agency. No, the question was, would it be possible to go back to the comfortable social contract where no one was threatening them with death, no one was threatening them with Siberia? So the communist elites read it I think they read it very accurately. They basically realized that the quest from the point of view of the Ukrainian society, from the grassroots, was that we, the Ukrainians, give you, the authorities, the right to change everything in order not to change anything. And to change everything in order to preserve the existing state of affairs was to proclaim independence and then freeze the relations inside that independence. So in a sense, Ukraine, when it proclaimed independence in 1991, was generally following the footsteps of the National Liberation Movement because it showed the only alternative to Soviet Union. But the National Liberation Movement, as we saw in 1991 presidential elections, had actually less than 30% of the votes in the Ukrainian society. So the former communists easily won the presidential elections. So the actual thing was that Ukraine was not probably born as the modern Ukrainian statehood was not probably born in 1991. It was conceived in 1991 when we had this spectacular combination of Democrats, nationalists, and communists all being in for the new independence. The communists controlled the Ukrainian parliament completely. They didn't need anyone else to form a coalition or something. So those were the communists who actually made it happen. One other issue is that the leadership was absolutely unique. Leonid Kravchuk who became the first Ukrainian president. He was a communist, but he had this sympathy towards Ukrainian culture and towards Ukrainian. I think he had some Ukrainian patriotic strings in him, which was actually interesting that he wasn't. His career didn't break somewhere midway. He actually was allowed to go all the way back, but masquerading and hiding was the name of the game in that time. So he actually was the one who who opened the opportunity for consensus, and this consensus was spectacular. 90% of Ukrainians said that yes, we want to live in an independent country. But what they thought would be that independent country would be the country that was full of resources, that would be quite paternalistic, and that didn't really need to undergo significant reforms. The Ukrainians actually expected that the country is so rich that they will be able to live off the rent of those riches. And the future proved very different. And that's when the painful social grinding, social transformation started to occur, forcing Ukraine to reform, forcing Ukraine to change. I think the Budapest Memorandum has played a great role in that, because what the Budapest Memorandum did, it took away the nukes from Ukraine, making the Ukrainian elites vulnerable and thus susceptible to external pressures from the West in the direction of reforms, from the society in the direction of reforms, but also from Russia in the direction against the reforms. If that would have happened with Russia, that probably would have been the best thing that would have happened with Russia. But as we hear now, Bill Clinton says that he's sorry that he forced Ukraine to give up the nukes. And I think he still doesn't get it. He should be sorry that he didn't force the Russians to give up the nukes, because that would open the path for social transformation in Russia, similarly to how it opened the path for social transformation in Ukraine. But actually, the concept in the West back then was that Russia is now somehow changed, and that it can be trusted, and that it can be involved in the international affairs. And Ukraine was just a new kid on the block, who knows who they are, and so Ukraine was basically disregarded, Russia was regarded, and that was the problem. And if it probably would have been fair if Russia would have been stripped of the nukes as a result of losing the Cold War, and then it would send a message that would probably prevent at least this war that we're in right now. And Ukraine would be on more equal footing with Russia in its anti-colonial quest.
And this is an interesting process here, because it's often interpreted that, Ukrainian elections have flip-flopped between more Eastern-looking and more Western-looking leaders. And of course, simplistically, that is interpreted as, well, you've got the sort of pro-Ukrainian, you've got the pro-Russian. Of course, it's far more complex than that. The process you're describing here is actually far more interesting, because it suggests that actually this process of choosing different leaders and sort of pulling in one direction or the other is much more, going for reform, reacting to, stagnation, corruption, etc., and wanting to go for reform, and then possibly in the next election, going for the status quo candidate. But rather than achieving a status quo, finding that the country gets dragged back to Moscow's orbit, then reacts against that and goes the other way. Has Ukraine been built through this almost process of sort of tidal shifts backwards and forwards? And of course, with Russia's invasion in 2014 and the full-scale invasion, it seems that that is now decisively, that momentum is now decisively moving in one direction, which is towards transformation.
I think there were two domains of change. One domain was the political orientations. Imagine Berlin Wall falling in Berlin in 1989. Then metaphorically, it didn't fall, it actually moved eastwards. So in 1991, we find Berlin Wall on the western border of the Soviet Union. So the Visegrad countries are now free. Poland is free, Hungary is free, Czech and Slovak countries separate and they're free, but Soviet Union is still not free. And actually, what happened in this first referendum in 1991, for the first time, the three regions inside Ukraine voted against supporting Moscow. And since then, they've been consistently voting for the Western vector in their political preferences. And then metaphorically, that means that that Berlin Wall has actually entered Ukraine, entered the Ukrainian territory, And then it was slowly, I'd say, I don't know, 50, 70, 100 kilometers a year moving eastwards. So you could see how Ukrainians first in Western Ukraine were voting for the Western vector, and then the rest of Ukraine was actually voting for pro-Russian vector, Eastern vector. And then Western and Central Ukraine started voting together, and then the Southern Ukraine started looking how they could join Western and Central Ukraine. So this was the change, and that was the visible change. And that caused the narrative of a deeply divided country that was exploited to the point that we couldn't hear it anymore. And it's especially interesting that we hear that deeply divided country argument from many of those who are now in a real deeply divided situation, like the United States, for instance. But these things happen, and then there is the second domain. The second domain was not that visible because you actually have to apply specific methodologies that are not tangible to see that, and that's the change in values. And the change in values was happening first of all in the conditions of freedom, but also in conditions of certain complexity. Usually those were big urban settings, and then that would go down into smaller towns and villages. And that was the change from paternalistic, I would say, a paternalistic culture where the person gives up its ability to decision make to a higher authority, against the agency, where you actually take on the responsibility and you actually want to decision make for yourself, and on your own for yourself. And this agency versus non-agency shift in values was mostly under-noticed, and that actually is the reason why we didn't see Kyiv in 3 days. This is, it's now something that Ukrainians like to poke in the eye to the Western experts who saw Kyiv falling in 3 days. And the reason Kyiv did not fall in 3 days was because institutions that are visible, they are the tip of the iceberg, in Ukraine are indeed weak. But we don't only rely on institutions. The difference of the governance model of Ukraine, if we compare Ukraine to the, I would say, Western mainstream, if such mainstream exists, is that a lot of weight is carried not by the institutions, but by the cultural links. So in a sense, Ukraine is a network society where those grassroots agencies have a way of communicating and decision making among themselves, so they can actually work autonomously, and they can actually take on quite sophisticated tasks and perform these tasks well. But you don't see that from the surface, because you really have to have your radars focused on grassroots to see that happening. So in fact, Ukraine may look very static if you look from above, but it's very dynamic if you look from the grassroots. And that's exactly what makes Ukraine and Russia so different. In Russia, there's one.
Yeah. Oh, well, right.
Yeah, one
yeah.
decision-making center in Ukraine.
Yes.
And in Ukraine, you've got, I don't know, 30 million decision-making centers.
Yeah. And this is fascinating to me because civic society is one of the offshoots of the network decision-making process you've described there. And, having been in Russia for some considerable time, you will have individuals, I found, who are dynamic, but it's very hard to form these kind of networks. So when I first went to Russia, you have this cliche that everything's lazy, everything's broken, everything. No, I found there were individuals there who were extremely dynamic and extremely productive. And I saw people essentially working themselves to death because without a sort of network to back that up, you can't amplify your own individual efforts. Now, the Soviet Union seemed to me a system built on the lines of that Russian vertical and Russification, not just in language and culture, but in this general attitude to vertical power, to showing deference and loyalty to the Tsar, to going along with laws and commands rather than trying to understand whether they're right or not. That was the model of the Soviet Union, and obviously inherited very much from pre-Soviet parts of Russian culture as well. How on earth did the Ukrainian way of doing things, this sort of networked or distributed or decentralized, how did that survive? Because it seems to me that every instrument in the Soviet Union was designed to disrupt and deconstruct that kind of behavior. Clearly, it didn't just ping into existence in 1991. It must have much deeper roots than that.
Oh, it goes back to the Cossacks. It goes back to medieval times, and the this grassroots agency is something that we see in Ukraine's history and in Ukraine's culture, for centuries and many generations. And actually, it's interesting that the Russian quest to conquer Ukraine was actually the quest to kill this agency all along, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. It's the same game. And in 21st century, hopefully, it will come to a stop. And that's exactly how Ukrainians perceive this war. This is not something that started now, and this is not something that has a meaning only in contemporary setting. It's from the Ukrainian optics. The hope is that this is the final act in the struggle that has many centuries, that has a tremendous legacy. And yes, this is the fight of the Soviet or imperial or colonial hierarchy of the Russian culture versus the decentralized environment of modern Ukraine. And in fact, the fight is not only external, this is also an internal fight, because one of the things that happened with Ukraine in 1991, that because Ukraine's statehood arise not from the clear victory of the national liberation movement, but because it was a consensus between the old elites and the new ideas. Ukraine has inherited the entire setting of the Soviet institutions. So, including the very critical perception by the society of the state. So in the West, the mainstream view is that the state is actually a service for the society that is that should be accountable to the society. From the Ukrainian perspective, the state is a foreign body that actually drains your resources and kills you. No one has killed more people in the last 100 years than the state that was governing Ukraine. Be that the Soviet state, the puppet state that the Nazis installed, or be that the communist state, be that the independent state run by the communists or run by their descendants from party of regions in Ukraine post-independence. So basically, the society has learned how to protect itself from the state. And the way Ukrainians do it is I'd say it's quite clever. Ukrainians withdraw the institutional trust from the institutions that they think can cause harm. So you can be quite popular, like Zelensky was after he was elected. But in fact, prior to the war, his rating was quite high, so his popularity level was quite high, but his trust, institutional trust in the position of the president of Ukraine, was running negative 23%. So there were 23% more Ukrainians that did not trust the president as the office, as the function, than who trusted. So what Ukrainians basically do is they manipulate with the institutional trust, giving or taking away a greater capability to certain institutions. So you can be very popular, but incapable. Or you can be very capable, but you don't necessarily register as a politically popular institution. For instance, civil society has incredible level of trust. The church has incredible level of trust. People like us, like the peers, they have incredible level of trust. And these are the preconditions to forming these networks. And these networks are extremely powerful. They can actually undertake projects that are of incredible size and complexity. And this is where the Russians, looking at the Russian society, seeing it unable of doing this, come up with all kind of conspiracy theories about Ukrainians being run by the CIA or whatever, because they just can't believe that people on a grassroots level can cooperate, can collaborate in such incredible ways. But that's been the second nature of Ukrainians. Actually, I've seen some publications in the Western journals that were politely knocking at that door and asking, is this a dysfunction of a governance model, or is this actually a different governance model that we're looking at? And I think that's a very interesting question for research for the future, because if this is a different model, then there's a risk that the Euro integration will crush it.
There's a couple of areas I wanted to focus on. I think we've probably got time to look at two more areas. You mentioned Stalinism earlier. Putin must be acutely aware of how Stalin handled populations, whether it's, Gulag, suppression, the Great Terror. He almost certainly doesn't look at these in the moralistic framework that we would as sort of Westerners or historians. He looks at these as tools. Is can he deploy this, that, and the other? Will it meet his objectives or not? Is it heavy-handed? Is it not? He's looking at these as things in his toolkit, potentially. Therefore, the expulsion of the Crimean Tatars is something that he must be looking at in the context of Ukraine. Do you think he has a concept in his mind that he could complete the work of Stalin by purging the Ukrainian lands, not just of Ukrainians, these things called Ukrainians, which he doesn't actually believe exist, but actually destroy this agency, which is a threat to his regime, and in his view, a threat to the vision he has for the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. This is something perhaps which Westerners do not get their head around, is the horror of what he's conceiving, potentially, the largest ethnic cleansing in history.
Indeed. I think Putin is very much trying to erase the Ukrainian identity as such. We hear a lot about the German model or about the Korean model in, suggestions how we should end this war from the West. But let me remind you that East Germany was still Germany. North Korea is still Korea. The occupied part of Ukraine is not Ukraine. Not a single Ukrainian library, not a single Ukrainian school, not a single Ukrainian book published. It's a complete land where you have social engineering and where you have oppression, and where you have just erasing of identity and Russification of enormous strength. I think Putin is a Stalinist, conceptually, he is a Stalinist leader. He is trying to do what Stalin was trying to do. And I think of course, he's not copying Stalin, but he's actually, I think he's inspired by Stalin. But there are some interesting takeaways here as well, because Putin doesn't claim Western Ukraine. And the reason for that is that Stalin was actually defeated by the Western Ukrainians. When he acquired, as a result of his deal with pact with Hitler, the Western Ukrainian territories, he decided to integrate Western Ukraine into the body of the Ukrainian Republic. So he connected something that had the agency with something where the agency was just erased by repressions and by the famine. Western Ukrainians, they of course didn't like that, because from 1939 till 1941, when the Germans invaded, there were enormous repressions from Stalin. Hundreds of thousands of Western Ukrainians were sent to Siberia, others were killed. But Stalin did not anticipate Hitler's attack. And because he did not anticipate Hitler's attack, his repression machine in Western Ukraine did not work under a deadline. So it was operating with the efficiency and power that it could have from the bureaucratic and other limitations. But when the Germans invaded in 1941, the Ukrainian agency was not completely crushed. And as a result, in 1943, we have the arisal of the Ukrainian insurgent army that actually kept on fighting both the Germans and the Soviets until the end of the Second World War and beyond the end of the Second World War. So Soviet Union was already developing the nuclear bomb. The situation in the world has changed, and Israel became a new state, and Stalin had to dissolve Comintern because he realized that he won't be able to conquer the entire world. But in the western part of the Soviet Union, in the Carpathian Mountains, the Ukrainian insurgent army was still fighting the Soviet forces. And it was crushed, not militarily, it was crushed only after the Soviets have created 4 times the size of the actual insurgency, a fake insurgency that could break the trust of the local population to anyone with the firearms. And basically, what the conclusion that Putin made out of this is that his limitations are where he can actually get a powerful response, a response with violence that he cannot overtake. So Western Ukrainians, in his view, have proven themselves to be those who he cannot conquer. So he is not talking about Western Ukraine, or he's not talking about Western Ukraine that much. And that gives us a clue what should the West do with Russia, is be strong. But when we have this anti-escalation concept, or incrementalist concept that is so conceptualized by Jake Sullivan and his school of thought, that actually invites Putin to apply greater force. That actually involves the West in the war to a greater extent than it could have involved the West. So we had a window of opportunity in 2022 to end this war by crushing Russia fast, but we've slept through in the West through that window of opportunity. As a result, we got the war of attrition. And now the West is very successfully basically pushing Ukrainians to um, take greater burden of the war upon themselves than the Western societies are taking. The Western soldiers are not fighting. The Western states are not committed to some warlike, taxation or warlike production. It's a matter of Ukrainians to fight and to survive this war. And that war of attrition that doesn't have the concept in the West that would allow to see Russia defeated is actually frustrating a lot of Ukrainians, and I think it will have long-term political consequences. I think what it does, it sows the seeds of the future anti-Western sentiment that will eventually arise politically, and it will arise already when Ukraine will be part of the formal institutions, the EU, NATO, etc. Look at Turkey, and that also didn't have to happen and doesn't have to happen. So every time Olaf Scholz is deciding not to send Taurus to Ukraine, every time we hear stupid excuses from other countries why they're not supplying this and that, every time the European governments try to be cheap on their promises and performance on these promises, we actually are in a situation when the price will come for that will come later, when actually the war will become more expensive for the Western world as well.
And just before we hit record, we were talking about the other delusion in the West, that this is a local conflict. This, in some way, they've internalized the Russian propaganda narrative that it is a civil war, as opposed to something that more resembles the Comintern, a kind of global struggle to replace one set of values with another, to replace the Russian world informal, vertical, sort of quasi-mafia, quasi-imperial sort of spheres of influence kind of concept, and push out rule of law, which has held sway over, say, global trade since the Second World War and a lot of global relations. There does seem to be this myopia that somehow, whether Ukraine wins or not, whether there's peace or not, that will be the end of it. Whereas we see through Russia's actions, firstly, in turning the territories that it occupies in Luhansk and Donetsk into a neo-Stalinist torture ground, essentially. They have outsourced the gulag under everybody's noses, and yet we're still not paying attention. Western leaders do not seem to realize that this concept, this toolkit of terror that Russia's developed, it can carry on exporting that, whether the war in Ukraine ends now, next week, in 5 years' time. There are other territories that could be within its crosshairs, Central Asia, etc. And as Russia runs out of materials, as it runs out of bodies that it can use in its army, it can turn what essentially is a parasitic policy in many different directions. And if the West is equally, let's say, non-interventionist or slow, there isn't going to be the same kind of resistance in Central Asian countries. The Baltics are far smaller. These could be overrun far, far quicker. What do we need to do to sort of wake up? What can Ukrainians and indeed people in the Baltics sort of say to Western leaders to snap them out of these illusions they seem to be laboring under?
I'm not sure that we can actually say anything more than we've said already. I think now it's a matter of the quality of reflection. I think all the arguments have been laid out, and now it's a matter of a discussion, internal discussion. And if a Ukrainian will be coming to a domestic discussion somewhere in Britain or in the United States or in France or in Germany, and I've participated in discussions like that, the Ukrainian voice is instantly dismissed as engaged and unobjective and
emotional
so,
is the other one, isn't it?
yeah,
Far too emotional. Yeah.
and you're far too emotional. You're affected. This is your trauma speaking. I've heard it all. But I think it comes to the point when actually two things have to happen from the Western perspective. First thing is the West should employ its best practices in analysis, research, and ability to comprehend what's happening. And I think the West has been lagging behind in realizing what's happening on the ground. There were far too many Russia experts who were actually in love with Russia and who were breaking the academic code of objectiveness and fairness in their judgment. There were far too many people who actually took money from Russia and acted as if they were independent, and they were not. So I think the West should employ its best practices to actually learning about the problem. And I think the West should have engaged in an honest internal discussion, and that's a discussion that has to happen between representatives of the West with the representatives of the West, because otherwise the price will come extremely high in terms of changes in international rules, and that will mean change in international trade, and that will mean diminishing disposable income for the households, and that will mean lowering the quality of life. But because these things will be coming gradually, a lot of people will not feel it right away. And the first ones to feel it will be the most vulnerable people, who are also the most susceptible to the Russian propaganda, to the cycles of disinformation, to the conspiracy theories, etc. And if we want to safeguard democracy, if we want to safeguard the rule of law, if we want to safeguard the good standard of living, I think we have to learn to protect ourselves at the same time. And I think the greatest input that Ukraine is making into the Western civilization right now is that it is offering, and it will be offering, a culture that at the same time allows you to be free, to have good quality of life, but also to be safe, to be protected. So security, not at the expense of the freedoms and not at the expense of the quality of life, is, I think, what Ukraine is offering through its culture. And I think this is something that we don't see. But in terms of public arguments, I think they've been laid out quite beautifully.
Mm-hmm. The very last question, I think, is how, through the process, let's assume there is some kind of victory or some kind of freezing of the lines of contact. That's obviously not ideal, but these are the two sort of scenarios. There is, of course, a third scenario, which is the collapse of Russia. We can only hope for that. We can't, think of that as guaranteed, especially given Western weakness, and our strategy seems to be designed to preserve the status quo in Russia rather than bringing the regime down. But let's assume there is, as Zelensky said, the hot war phase ends. How can Ukraine preserve this extraordinary network effect, civic society effect that you've talked about, especially when, let's assume that vast funds pile into Ukraine for reconstruction? That seems to me not just an opportunity, but also a huge threat to the civic society ethos, to the inclusiveness or that desire for sort of fairness and justice, which many Ukrainians seek. If that money gets into too few hands or is distributed in a top-down fashion rather than being channeled through, say, veterans groups and civic society organizations, it's ironically not the pressure from Russia that could threaten this cohesion. It is the influx of wealth and money from the West for reconstruction that could cause division and disunity.
I think we're trying to run too fast and imagine something that is too far down the road. My institute is called Frontier Institute for a reason. even if the hot stage of this war ends quickly, the underlying causes for the war will not dissolve quickly. So we're stuck in this standoff for years and years, maybe decades, maybe generations, depending on how well we perform. Because what we're up against is not Putin. We're up against a certain type of imperialist culture that can outlive Putin. And the ability of Ukrainians to resist, the very resilience of Ukraine, is actually based in the culture. And that same culture is the culture that has strong anti-corruption views, because it sees that the corruption vertical, the corruption hierarchy, is actually the hierarchy that allowed Russia to penetrate Ukraine's institutions. It has the same nature of as other means that the Russian imperialism is using against Ukraine. So this is why I'm saying that we should take a greater cultural optics, because then we are not thinking in terms of political cycles, transactional politics. Then we actually see the long, as Ivan Krastev puts it, the long history mode. And then we can see that this is a standoff between different cultures of governance, different models of governance, and they will outlive the war. So we actually have to understand that what Ukraine has at this point is a very imperfect set of institutions, but far more advanced political culture that will eventually allow to modernize the institutions, to change the institutions. And some of these modernizations, some of these changes are actually needed in the West as well. So it's a win-win situation for the Ukraine joining the West and the West joining Ukraine. But we view it way too transactionally. We're debating whether it's 40 billion or 50 billion, whether it's so many shells or so many shells. This is a nonsense debate. Actually, the war will cost much more. Actually, reconstruction will cost much more. And yes, we're all interested in making sure that both the war and reconstruction takes as few resources as possible with the greatest effect. But we should remember that this is far greater than the cost of particular highway reconstruction and the cost of particular school built or the cost of particular shells produced.
Well, as that unfolds in the coming months, I think it would be useful to reach back out and dive more deeply into not just how reconstruction can take place, equitable reconstruction, but how Ukrainian values may finally not be concealed from the world, but start to penetrate into Western institutions and indeed change Western political culture as well, which certainly, if you've seen any of the videos on this channel, we talk a lot about how those, the culture around democracy needs a transformation and a refresh in the West. But Yevhen, thank you so much for joining the channel. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Let's see if Ukraine can vaccinate the world, and thank you for inviting me.